You are 17 years old. You have never owned a pair of proper football boots until 6 months ago. You grew up stuffing socks into a grapefruit to practice because your family could not afford a ball. You come from a country where electricity cuts out without warning and where the roads in your neighborhood are not paved. And right now, you are standing in the tunnel of the Rosunda Stadium in Stockholm, Sweden, about to walk out into a World Cup final. The year is 1958. The country you are representing is Brazil. And nobody in the stadium, nobody watching on the televisions that have just started appearing in living rooms across Europe, nobody in the press box where the journalists are already writing their match previews. Nobody knows your name. They will. His name was Edson Arantes do Nascimento. Everyone called him Pele. He had been given the nickname as a child, possibly after a local goalkeeper, possibly from a corruption of the name of a footballer he admired. The exact origin has never been fully agreed upon. He disliked the nickname intensely when he was young. He was teased for it. He got into fights over it. And then, somewhere along the way, the name became larger than the person, and the person grew to fit inside it. He was born in 1940 in Três Corações, a small city in the state of Minas Gerais, Brazil. His father, João Ramos do Nascimento, known as Dondinho, had been a professional footballer of some ability whose career was cut short by a knee injury. Pelé grew up watching his father try to play through pain, and then watching his father fail to play at all, and this left a mark on him that never fully went away. He understood, from very early, that football could be taken from you. The family moved to Bauru, in the state of São Paulo, when Pelé was still a child. They had very little money. He shined shoes on the street to help the family. He played football with any object he could find, a sock stuffed with rags, a grapefruit, whatever the neighborhood boys could agree on as a ball. He played barefoot. He played in the street. He played with a quality that was noticeable to everyone who saw him, even then, even at 8 and 9 years old, the way certain things are noticeable before you have language for them. At 15, he was invited to train with Santos FC, one of Brazil's most prominent clubs. His talent was evident within days. At 16, he made his professional debut. He scored on his debut. By the time he was 16 and a half, he was the top scorer in the Brazilian league. And then, in 1958, when he was 17 years old, the Brazilian Football Federation selected him for the World Cup squad that would travel to Sweden. He was not supposed to play. He was young. He had a minor knee injury that had been flagged by the team doctor. There were senior players with more experience, more caps, more claim to a starting position. The expectation, when the squad was named, was that Pelé would travel, observe, learn, and return to Brazil a little wiser and a little older, with 4 more years of development ahead of him before he would genuinely contend for a World Cup place. Brazil had never won the World Cup. They had come close, desperately, heartbreakingly close, in 1950, when they hosted the tournament and needed only a draw in their final group match against Uruguay to be crowned champions. They lost 2-1 in a defeat so devastating that the journalist Eduardo Galeano later wrote that it was as if the country itself had died that afternoon. The grief of 1950 had not lifted in 8 years. It sat inside Brazilian football like a splinter that had never been removed. The 1958 squad arrived in Sweden carrying that history. The coach, Vicente Feola, was methodical and cautious. Brazil's early matches were solid but not spectacular. Something was missing. There was quality in the squad but not yet cohesion. Not yet the thing that makes a team feel inevitable. In the quarterfinal against Wales, Feola made a decision. He selected Pelé. He was 17 years, 249 days old when he played that quarterfinal. He scored the only goal of the game. It was the first World Cup goal ever scored by Pelé. He received the ball with his back to goal, flicked it over the head of a Welsh defender with his left foot, and volleyed it into the net with his right before it touched the ground. The move was so fast, so technically complete, that the Welsh defender later said he had no idea what had happened. Brazil beat France 5-2 in the semifinal. Pelé scored a hat-trick. He was crying at the final whistle, overwhelmed, and his teammates gathered around him, some of them old enough to be his father, and held him while he shook. And then came the final. June 29, 1958. Brazil versus Sweden. The host nation. The Rosunda Stadium in Stockholm held approximately 50,000 people, and it was full. Sweden took the lead after 4 minutes. The crowd erupted. For a brief, sickening moment, the ghost of 1950 seemed to stir. Brazil equalized before halftime, and then, in the second half, Pelé took over. In the 55th minute, he received a high ball in the Swedish penalty area. He was surrounded by defenders. He chest-trapped the ball, flicked it over the head of a Swedish center-back with his left thigh, span around him, and volleyed it into the net. The sequence, trap, flick, spin, volley, took approximately 3 seconds. The Swedish defender he beat later said, in an interview given years afterward, that he had never in his career encountered anything like it, that it felt like playing against someone operating under different physical rules. Pelé scored again before the final whistle. Brazil won 5-2. The scoreline was identical to their semifinal against France. It was as if the team had found a register of excellence and locked into it. When the final whistle blew, Pelé collapsed on the pitch. Teammates lifted him. He was carried. He was 17 years old and he had just won the World Cup. He was crying so hard that the television footage, which was black and white and slightly grainy in the way that footage from 1958 always is, could not fully capture his face because it was buried in the shoulder of a teammate. The Swedish crowd, their own team's supporters, gave Brazil a standing ovation. This was not a polite acknowledgement. This was genuine recognition of something they had witnessed that they knew was not ordinary. And here is where the story becomes more than a sports story. Pelé did not stop. That is the thing that separates his career from a remarkable moment and turns it into something that reshaped the history of the sport. He came back 4 years later to Chile for the 1962 World Cup. He was injured early in the tournament, torn muscle, and missed most of the games. Brazil won anyway, driven now by Garrincha. Pelé collected his second World Cup winner's medal from a hospital bed. He was 22 years old with 2 World Cup titles. He went to the 1966 World Cup in England and was kicked so viciously by the defenders of Portugal and Bulgaria that he left the tournament injured and declared publicly that he would never play in a World Cup again. He was targeted deliberately. Referees offered him no protection. He was the most famous footballer on earth, and the tactical response of opposing teams had evolved specifically to destroy him physically. And then, 4 years later, he changed his mind. Mexico, 1970. Pelé was 29 years old. He had spent the intervening years dominating Brazilian football, winning league titles with Santos, playing exhibition matches across the world to audiences who had never seen football before and came away converts. He had become, in some sense, bigger than the sport itself, a name that people recognized in countries where football was barely played. The 1970 Brazil squad is still, by the consensus of most serious football historians, the greatest national team ever assembled. Jairzinho, who scored in every single match of the tournament. Rivellino with his explosive left foot. Tostão, elegant and precise. Gerson, conducting from midfield with the patience of a chess grandmaster. And Pelé, older now, less reliant on raw pace, but reading the game with an intelligence that made his movements seem inevitable. In the final against Italy, Brazil won 4-1. Pelé scored the first goal, heading the ball with extraordinary precision past the Italian goalkeeper. He set up the fourth goal, controlling the ball in the penalty area, and without looking delivering a pass to his right that found Carlos Alberto arriving at full speed to strike one of the most technically perfect goals in World Cup history. When that final whistle blew, Pelé had 3 World Cup winners' medals. No other player in the history of the tournament has matched this. It remains, more than 50 years later, unreached. The sports psychologist Daniel Gould, who has spent his career studying the development of elite performance, argues that what separates the truly great from the merely excellent is not physical ability alone, but what he calls competitive resilience. The capacity to perform at the highest level not once, not in one golden moment, but across years, across setbacks, across the specific cruelty that time inflicts on athletic bodies. Pelé demonstrated this in 1958 at 17, when the world had not heard his name. He demonstrated it again in 1962, when injury took him from the tournament he had expected to define. He demonstrated it in 1966, when the violence directed at him would have driven a lesser person from the sport. And he demonstrated it one final time in 1970, when he was old enough that the question of whether he was still at his peak was being discussed openly, and he answered the question with a tournament of such authority that it closed the debate permanently. The sociologist Eduardo Archetti, who studied Latin American sport and identity throughout his career, wrote that Pelé's significance to Brazil extended far beyond football. Brazil in the late 1950s was a country in transformation, moving from an agrarian economy to an industrial one, carrying enormous inequality, deeply uncertain about its identity and its place in the world. The World Cup victory of 1958, led by a 17-year-old with no money, playing a style of football that was fluid and improvisational, and entirely unlike the rigid systems of the European teams they defeated, became a statement about what Brazil was and what Brazil could be. It was not accidental that Brazilian football of that era was described as Jogo Bonito, the beautiful game. The phrase was not marketing, it was a description of a philosophy, that football at its highest expression should be played with joy, with creativity, with the freedom to improvise, with the understanding that winning and beauty were not in conflict, but were, in fact, the same thing. Pelé did not invent that philosophy, but he was its most complete embodiment. He made 50,000 Swedish supporters applaud an opposing team because what they were watching was too beautiful to respond to in any other way. He was 17 years old. He was crying on a football pitch in Stockholm. He had never owned a pair of proper football boots until 6 months earlier. And the world would spend the next 6 decades arguing about whether anyone had ever played the game better. The answer, most people eventually decided, was no.